So we typically want somewhere between 20 to 25% average sward clover content. And a sward that is achieving that, we typically don't hit that 20% average sward clover content till the first half of May. Below that 20%, we are getting some level of fixation, but it's probably not enough to meet plant growth requirements. So when we start talking about taking out or reducing chemical fertilizer, we probably need somewhere around that 20% or very close on it when we can start significantly stepping back fertilizer. And if we do it before that and early on in the year, there is a chance then that you can reduce the overall production from that within the system.
I'm joined this week by Teagasc grassland science researcher Mike Egan to discuss the correct management of grass clover swards in order to ensure high levels of pasture and animal performance. Mike also discusses the findings from the recent external assessment of Teagasc's clover and multi-species sward research programme. I started by asking Mike to explain why we've seen a resurgence in the interest of grass white clover swards.
Yeah, so look at it. It's probably a combination of different things in terms of policy, in terms of it's now a requirement to include it in reseeds and irrigation farms for the last number of years, and all farmers now at the moment in reseeds. We have a legal limit to reduce chemical fertilizer rates. And I suppose farmers are also seeing the benefit then in terms of animal performance and being able to reduce chemical fertilizer from a cost, economic and environmental point of view. So it probably is a combination of all of them. And look, there has been a huge amount of research that has been done over the last 10, 15 years in Teagasc as a whole. And all of that information now is put out there and the benefits are being there. So I think it is a kind of a 2-3-pronged approach in terms of the legal requirements that we have to know and also the benefit that farmers can get from it.
And one of those main benefits, obviously, of grass white clover swards is the ability to fix nitrogen and therefore reducing the chemical N inputs, which you've mentioned there. When it comes to nitrogen fixation, what can be expected when white clover is included in the sward?
Yeah, it's probably a very hard answer to give a direct definition of it or the exact quantity of it because there's so many factors that can influence it. But look, all being equal and conditions and all being allowed, we can expect to get somewhere in the region of 80 to 100 kilos of fixation per hectare per year in our swards across the grazing season or the calendar year. But there's a lot of factors that influence that. And if we look at a year like this year compared to last year, there's going to be huge levels of variation in level of clover content is going to be fixed, or nitrogen is going to be fixed from the clover. So we need to understand what influences it first to be able to reload and then be able to manage that to get the potential from it. And if we look at what, first of all, is fixation, it is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into a plant usable form, ammonia. And that's through a symbiotic relationship in the soil rhizobia bacteria that infect the root nodules and the clover plant. So the clover plant feeds the bacteria energy or carbon, and then that bacteria then provides the mechanism to convert that atmospheric nitrogen into a plant usable source that the clover plant can use, and then it's released into the soil when the nodules decay for the grass or whatever else. But and that's the process of how it happens. But to do that, we need to have enough clover content in the sward. The more clover content we have, the higher level of fixation we'll get. We need good soil fertility. P and pH, particularly pH, influence the level of rhizobia bacteria and nodulation, and that is what determines how much clover or how much nitrogen we're going to get fixed. And then we have atmospheric conditions, soil temperatures of 10 degrees and above and rising. So if we have low soil temperatures, we're going to get lower levels of fixation. If we have higher soil temperatures, we're going to get higher levels of fixation. Rainfall, sunshine, we don't really like high rainfall that we had kind of the start of last year and the back end of 2023, or again, very dry soil conditions. So we need that balance of it. And then our management factors on top of that all influence it. And all of those coming together can influence the level of fixation that we're going to get. So it's we know we can get up to 100 kilos of fixation per hectare per year, but we need to have a lot of things right, and the year needs to be right to be able to achieve that. And that's what happened last year, if we look at it.
Mm. And I suppose we're in early June now, Mike. How are clover contents and how are these swards actually looking now in 2025?
Yeah, look, compared to where we were last year, clover content seem to be very, very good. If we look at, and even coming back to the on-farm study that we have, like last spring 2024 compared to the previous 2 or 3 years in 22 and 2023, we were between 8 and 10% lower average sward clover content in April of last year, and about 4 to 5% lower sward clover content in June of last year compared to the previous years. This year, we are back on track where we were in 2023 and 2022 in terms of the level of clover, and that really is because of that good spring, dry, warm spring that we have had that has really favoured clover. Like if we think clover is a Mediterranean plant and it likes warm conditions, high sunlight hours, high temperatures, and as well as good soil fertility. So if we have that, we can get it. We didn't have that last year. Like if we look at the first 8 months of last year, the 5 of the first 8 months of last year were below the previous 15-year average air temperature. And the first 5 of the 6 months last year, we had higher average mean rainfall levels than we did in the previous 10 to 15 years. So, like the climatic conditions dramatically influence the level of clover that we're going to have in our sward, and also then the level of fixation in turn that we're going to get from that. So, it is important to understand that when we have a year like 2024, that it's not that clover isn't working, it's the conditions aren't there to increase the level of clover that we're going to have in our sward. So as a whole, clover contents this year are looking very good compared to where they were this time last year.
That's interesting, the fact, because when we talk about clover, I often hear you mention in terms of, managing the farm on a paddock by paddock basis. But really, there, what you're saying is that there's a seasonal effect as well in terms of our management and maybe what we're going to do around that. 2024 was a difficult year, whereas 2025 is looking like our grass clover swards are and should perform pretty well.
Yeah, completely. Like so, and I think so. I do agree that we do need to manage clover on a individual farm basis, in terms of blanket messaging, and also on an individual paddock basis within farms, because we're going to have different levels of clover. But the conditions in terms of a year, and that's within a farm or within a year effect, but in between years we have to adjust it as well. And like if we look at last year, if we have 10% less sward clover content in April compared to what we have this year, if we have 10% less sward clover content, that's less clover plants that is going to fix atmospheric nitrogen. If we have 10% more clover, that is 10% more plants that's going to fix atmospheric nitrogen. So on years like last year, when we have lower sward clover content because of the year effect, in turn, to maintain production, we need to then increase the level of fertilizer that we're applying in turn with that. And like in terms of the seasonal effects, then like clover is a warm season plant. Perennial ryegrass starts to go between 5 to 6 degrees soil temperature and above. Clover is about 8 to 9 degrees soil temperature and above to start growing, and fixation is 10 degrees soil temperature and above. And if we look at it on a year by year basis, we typically don't hit that 10 degrees soil temperature until sometime in April, on mid-April onwards. And last year was even later because of the very cold, wet spring that we had. This year, slightly earlier because we have a very good condition. So, like if we're looking at that point of view alone, we have to adjust our chemical fertilizer strategies in line with the level of clover and the year effect that we're having as well.
The sort of contents that you're looking for, Mike?
Yeah, so like when we talk about sward clover content, we typically talk about average sward clover content. And what we're typically targeting is somewhere between 20 to 25% average sward clover content across the year. Now, that is from less than 10% in February and March, peaking at 35-40% in July, August, and then declining then as the end of the year comes off again. And again, like if we have a paddock that has 10% versus 20%, that 20% paddock is going to fix more nitrogen than the 10% paddock just because there's more clover plants there. So we typically want somewhere between 20 to 25% average sward clover content. And a sward that is achieving that, we typically don't hit that 20% average sward clover content till sometime in probably the first half of May. Generally, we don't hit that 20%. And we know, and research work that was done in Moore Park and other Teagasc centres over the last number of years has shown that like below that 20%, we are getting some level of fixation, but it's probably not enough to meet plant growth requirements. So when we start talking about taking out or reducing chemical fertilizer, we probably need somewhere around that 20% or very close on it when we can start significantly stepping back fertilizer. And if we do it before that, and early on in the year, there is a chance then that you can reduce the overall production from that within the system.
So, and you've touched on it already, but what is the advice then regarding chemical nitrogen application? We'll say our farmer listeners Now we're in early June. What does that look like for the remainder of the summer and into the autumn?
Yeah, so again, I think it needs to come back to that paddock by farm and within farm paddock by paddock basis then as well. And it is completely dictated by the level of clover that you have in your paddocks. As I said already, the more clover you have, the more fixation you have. If you have a 5% paddock or 10% paddock on your farm and a 25% paddock on your farm, you cannot treat them the exact same in terms of nitrogen. If you do, you're going to undersupply one in terms of nitrogen, or you're going to oversupply one in terms of nitrogen if you apply the same level of nitrogen on both of them. So you have to be tailored on it. And first of all, like we typically get very low levels of fixation in the spring because we don't have high enough soil temperatures or typically sward clover contents. So our spring nitrogen regime is typically the same. And if we look at the nitrogen strategy that's in the clover manual, there is very little, if any, difference in the first 3 applications in terms of the overall chemical fertilizer rates up until the beginning of May or end of April. In line with it. And it's from then on that you can make the decision. So first of all, that decision needs to be made in April in terms of how much clover we have in our farms in April, and then make the decision on reducing or taking it out or keeping it in, depending on the level of clover that you have. But if we have a paddock that was somewhere around 10 to 15% in April, when we making this decision to reduce or take out chemical fertilizer for the remainder of the year. Like if we're now in June, we're talking somewhere between 10 to 15 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per month. And if we know if we can reduce, and that's looking at the nitrogen strategy table that's in the clover manual. But like, and if we look at in June at sward clover content that's averaging 23%, fixing somewhere around 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare across the entire year. Like in June, we're fixing somewhere between 15 and 20 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in June, the month of June alone. So it's probably not enough to meet the full requirements of what we need to grow that 30-day kilo or 30 over that 30-day period. So we're topping it up with between 10 and 15 kilos to get to that 30 kilo total nitrogen for the 30 days or the month. The majority of that is coming from fixation, and the remainder then is coming from chemical or organic, depending on what you have. And again, if you have paddocks then that are down at very low levels of sward clover content at 5, we're getting very little, if any, fixation at that time point. So we need to go at higher levels of chemical fertilizer. So if you have paddocks at the moment that are sitting somewhere around 20%, you're probably talking somewhere around 10 to 15 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per month. If you have paddocks that are sitting somewhere around 30 kilos of 30% sward clover content, you're probably talking about between 5 and 10 kilos of nitrogen, or even just organic or soil water making up that difference. And if you have paddocks that are down at less than 10%, you're probably talking somewhere between 20 and 25 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for the month of June. And the remainder then will be topped up by things. So it's very hard to give a definite answer. It has to be dictated by the level of clover that you have in this ward.
And Mike, I suppose some farmers listening to this will say, well, I'm going to one paddock with X amount and going to another paddock. I suppose to reduce the complication at farm level, you're probably batching those paddocks and you're making a call on a percentage of those paddocks.
Yeah, like I think it's like we can be very descriptive in the level of clover that we have in our sward, and like when we're talking to groups and we're talking to farmers, like they're concerned, is it 17.5% or is it 21.2%? I think we can get very detailed in it. I think if you can categorize your farm into 3 categories, the ones that you have no clover, ones that you have exceptional clover, and ones then that are somewhere in the middle. And yes, it's probably more complicated than just going with one rate of chemical fertilizer everywhere. But I think to get the value of it, number one, and of clover in the sward, and number two, maintain herbage production. While reducing chemical fertilizer inputs, we need to have a strategic or a tailored approach to it. So I think it is a batching it in. Pasture based now allows that. You can batch your paddocks into there's 4 categories on pasture base: 0, low, medium, and high. So you can batch your paddocks into it and even go that way on it. Yes, it can be complicated, but I think we need to move more towards that scenario to get the benefit from it. But you're right. It's not you're bunching your 5 or 6 paddocks that you know that have the best clover, that they only get soil water this month or powder washings or whatever it may be, and you have a group of paddocks in that have no clover. They're getting their standard 20, 25, 38, 28 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per month, and then whatever else is in the middle of it. So I think if you batch them that way, pasture base now allows you to do that, and it'll give you a color-coded map based on the paddocks that have the different levels of clover on it. And it does make it easier, particularly if you have contractors coming in, or even you're doing it to spread. You know these 4 paddocks are getting X rate, these 5 paddocks are getting Y.
We hear of some farmers spreading 0 nitrogen on grass clover paddocks, Mike.
Yeah.
what's the advice with that regard?
So I think like the zero nitrogen on paddocks is not necessarily an issue if you have enough clover in the paddocks. And going around to farms, there are probably not many farms that have enough on it. So like going with zero nitrogen in the summer is an option if you have exceptionally high sward clover contents in it and you're going with some level of powder washings or slurry, watery slurry on those. If we take out nitrogen in the spring, though, it is going to reduce overall production or grass growth because of the lack of fixation or the lower levels of fixation early on in the year. So I would be very slow to take out nitrogen in the spring because it is going to reduce spring yield, and that has a huge knock-on effect on total cumulative herbage production. So I think we need to keep that the same. Then we need to make that decision at the end of April, early May on those group of paddocks. And if you have paddocks that you can feel that are going to get zero nitrogen for 1 or 2 applications, it is better to go in with parlour washings or soil water. And the research here in Moorpark and Clonakilty and Grange and somewhat in Athenry as well has shown that when we go in with that parlour washing, the slurry water for that 1 or 2 rounds that you're taking out the nitrogen, you will maintain higher production on those paddocks without compromising clover contents. But when you go to an absolute zero rate of nitrogen, there is a chance that you can reduce overall herbage production, particularly in the spring because of the lower levels of fixation. And you need an exceptionally high level of sward clover content in the sward to be able to do that. And when you do that in the absence of the level of clover, the chances are you're going to reduce overall herbage production or cumulative herbage production. And that is what we cannot afford to do. Well, like when we move to a lower nitrogen system nationally, we cannot afford to compromise production. And that has happened dramatically over like if we look at nitrogen fertilizer rates, we had a target to get under 300,000 tonne by 2030. We achieved that in 2023. It was at 280 tonne. 1,000 tonne. It was just over 300,000 tonne in 2024. We've already achieved that target. But if we look at pasture-based figures, we're back about 1.2 tonne over the last 3 years compared to the previous 3-year average. So by taking out the nitrogen at the moment without having enough clover, we're compromising production. And that is forcing an import then of concentrate and purchase forage into the system, which all it is doing is swapping nitrogen inputs. We're taking out chemical nitrogen and we're bringing in another form of nitrogen in the form of feed. So we have to be very careful when we do go that route of taking out or eliminating nitrogen, that we have enough clover in our swards and we do so strategically at the right times of the year.
It's often based on, or the rationale behind it, the zero N is the concept that plant N fixation will reduce where chemical N is applied, Mike, and that maybe the clover won't persist as well. Is there any truth in that?
Look, when you apply chemical fertilizer, you are going to compromise some level of fixation in it. But by taking it out, by taking it out completely, you're probably not going to make up the shortfall of the difference between the two, if that makes sense. So yes, you will compromise some level of fixation on it, but if you keep your grazing management in check in terms of good soil fertility, good pre-grazing covers, you can still maintain high levels of sward clover content. And the work here in Moorpark from 2012, when I started my own PhD, up until 2024 last year, so it's going for 12 years, there are paddocks there that have received 150 kilos of chemical nitrogen per hectare per year. Those swards are still maintaining sward clover contents of between 20 and 24% that are 8 to 12-year-old. Some of those swards now, they're getting 150 kilos of chemical fertilizer. They're growing on average over that period 13.6 tonne. Over that period, 150 kilos of nitrogen, and still maintaining sward clover content. But we're doing so, we're only taking out, we're applying the nitrogen when the plant needs it, and we're taking it out when the plant is or reducing it when the plant is providing it. So yes is the answer, but not to the same extent as taking out nitrogen in terms of losing production.
100%. P and K applications, how important are they, we'll say, over the coming weeks and months? We'd be hopeful that a lot of paddocks have obviously got, that'll be a slurry application or whatever it is there in the springtime, and I've got some P and K there, but how important is that?
Yeah, so K is very important, particularly if you have a lower soil fertility is very important, first of all, for clover establishment and long-term persistence in it. So we need a soil pH of 6.5, and whether that's when you're sowing them or maintaining it in the sward. So we need to regular soil sampling and maintaining that 6.5. That 6.5 minimum soil pH for clover increases the rhizobia bacteria and nodulation, which accounts for the level of fixation. So soil fertility, if we have low soil pH, we need to address that, otherwise it's going to compromise overall fixation levels. K then is very important for stolon production, and stolon production is the means by which a clover plant persists. So again, even in index trees, paddocks and onwards, some level of maintenance K levels to maintain those index trees is important, and it's more of a drip feed application across the summer. A lot of that can be made from slurry or parlour washings if across the year as well, early on and across the summer period on it as well from the P and K. So it is important for persistence. P is really important for the establishment phase, but K and soil pH is very important for the long-term persistence on them.
I suppose the one thing about K is we're not limited in terms of the amount of K that can be brought in.
No, and like there's a lot of protected rear products there now that have K in it at low enough rates that you can still get out enough nitrogen and K within it. And so it is feasible to do that on it. And again, even if you don't have a P allowance, like even the parlour washings, you're still getting out in parlour washings 2 to 3 units of P per 1,000 gallons on it. And if you do that 2,000 gallons over 2 or 3 applications over the grazing season, you're still meeting a lot of that maintenance P requirements that is required for maintaining it and increasing the level of clover in the sward.
Very good. Grazing management, to ensure good clover content exists throughout the swards. How important is the grazing management piece?
It's vital. And look, at most people say that increasing the level of chemical fertilizer kills out clover, and in part high levels of that is part and true, but it's not really that the nitrogen kills the clover. When you apply chemical fertilizer, grass uptakes, because there's a more vigorous root structure, uptakes the nitrogen faster than the clover plant will, and what happens then, it accelerates the grass growth compared to the clover growth in the combination of the sward, and the clover can get out competed or shaded out of it. So that is the biggest complication with maintaining clover in the sward is grazing management. Clover likes warm, dry soils and light. And the only way you're going to get light is good grazing management in terms of pre-grazing covers and residuals. And residuals are key here. If we allow our residuals to build up, what you can get is called aerial stolons, that if you can't get light, the stolons need light on the base of the sward. The stolons will start to lift higher up in the sward. They'll produce longer petioles and bigger leaves to get more light high up and reduce the level of stolons that they're producing. And when we do that, that will reduce the persistency of the sward. And the only way to maintain clover in swards long-term outside of adequate and good soil fertility is grazing management, not damaging, pugging and poaching it in the shoals of the year. And this time of the year, ensuring that pre-grazing covers are kept to that 1,500 kilos. If we look at pasture at the moment, that is creeping up dramatically on farms at the moment. So residuals covers are getting high, and then maintaining residuals of 4 to 4.5 centimeters max. So we allow light down to the base of the sward. And all else being equal, that is the biggest factor for reducing the persistency or the long-term persistency of clover in swards. If we can maintain good soil fertility and excellent grazing management, we can keep white clover in our swards at the required levels for 8 to 10 years, as long as we had good grazing management. So the key thing to get at the moment is pre-grazing covers back on track and good grazing residuals in terms of hitting that 4 centimeters. What we need is light down to the base of the sward. We're getting a lot of stolon production. Most of the stolon production happens from June onwards, and we'll hit a peak sward or stolon density in August, September. All that needs is light to the base of the sward. And if we go and get that light down now, it's going to reduce the stolon density, which will have a knock-on effect on the clover content even into next year.
Yeah. Are there other ways to improve clover contents, maybe where a farmer isn't fully satisfied with the paddock? I've heard of the possibility of cutting surplus. Does that help improve?
Yes, probably surpluses. When we take the big cuts of silage, in terms of your big bulky cuts, that can reduce the level of clover, because you're building up such a cover and you're doing you're reducing so much light down to the base of the sward that it reduces the stolon. So big cuts of silage kind of deplete the level of clover over a period of time. But taking out surplus, and particularly if you have a paddock that has had a poor residual the last round or the last 2 rounds, taking out that surplus paddock, correcting the residual and allowing light down to the base of the sward will increase it. So good grazing management and maintaining residuals. And a part of that is going to be taking out surplus silage out of it in residuals that have got too high to get them back in track before the damage is done in terms of reducing the stall on density on it. So yes, cutting can do it, but also don't knock, and I know this isn't about establishment, but on paddocks that you're not satisfied in, low pre-grazing covers, low residuals for the year will increase the soil density and increase clover content next year, and even carrying a lower cover on it over the winters, closing them later on, those individual paddocks later on in the final rotation. But also some bit of strategic oversowing in the spring every year on paddocks that you're not overly satisfied can maintain it in the sport long term as well. So it's probably a three-pronged approach in terms of mid-season grazing management, autumn grazing management, and strategic oversowing.
Okay.
And surplus bales are going to be a part of that.
Very good. I suppose the obvious concern then from farmers around grass clover swards, Mike, is managing bloat risk.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give to farmers in order to manage that risk on their farms?
Yeah, so and I think this comes back to the level of clover that we have in our sward. So like when we everything we have talked about is around at 20-25% average sward clover content, because we want a balance of grass and we want a balance of clover within the sward. And if we lose that balance and it tips in the favor of clover, and particularly when if we take out chemical nitrogen, particularly early on in the spring, grass needs nitrogen and P to tiller out. And if we take out that nitrogen and we're not supplying it from fixation early on in the year, you can get clover dominant swards. And that is a risk then for later on in the year with bloat. So bloat is a risk, but what we want to do is maintain the balance of clover in terms of not no clover or too low levels of clover, but not excessive levels of clover when we get to that kind of 50s and 60% average sward clover contents or peak sward clover contents. That's when the risk comes into place. So bloat can be a risk. We need to know the key risk factors. One is excessively high levels of clover in the sward. That can be controlled somewhat by grazing management and strategic nitrogen applications, particularly early on in the year, to get that balance right in it. Second point then is excessively hungry animals going into these high clover content paddocks. They're going to gorge on the clover first versus going on to the grass. Very low pre-grazing cover, so we have very low fibres in it, particularly after grass, if you have it, or going into very low pre-grazing covers in the back end of the year. And then the last one then is low dry matter grass. And they're probably the four key risk areas that we need to be aware of. You can get one or all four of those on an individual morning. Once you're aware of the four, it's easier to put a preventive in place. And the preventives are bloat oil in the water. Typically, if you're going to bloat oil in the water, because you typically get it on the low dry matter, drizzly mornings, they're not going to consume the water before they graze. The water needs to be in the trough at least 12, if not 24 hours beforehand. So some of that bloat oil is in the system. The second one then is your breakfast break or grazing wire. So you're putting up a small 2 to 3 hour break in the paddock to stop the initial gorging process of all the paddock. Secondly, particularly with larger herds that are milking for a long period of time, all the herd or the majority of the herd going out together, so that the first 2 or 3 rows of the cows that are gone out are not going to gorge on the clover, even if you're using the breakfast break. And in extreme cases then, putting some bit of fibre source in it. But again, that's an extreme case. The majority of people are using is that breakfast break and ensuring all of the herd goes out at the same time. And that's probably the key risk factor that can be done. And after 2 or 3, if a cow is going to get bloat, they're going to get it within 2 hours of going into the paddock. So it's being aware of the risk periods and then putting some preventative in place afterwards. The breakfast break and then the bloat oil, and be consistent all of the time that you're not kind of chopping and changing all of the time within it. And as we get more clover in our farms, it's going to be easier to manage that.
Finally, maybe to finish up, there was an external assessment of Teagasc's clover and multi-species sward research program. Can you maybe just explain the rationale for conducting this firstly?
Yeah. So it's something that the director called for early on this year. And I suppose there has been clover work going on in Moorpark and Teagasc as a whole, for close on 15 years, and a lot of individual studies that has gone on. And I suppose the key point of the review, and it was also on multi-species swards as well, but I suppose the key point of view was to bring all of this clover and multi-species work into one document or one report and look at it all together. So Sinclair, he's retired now, but he was in so Sinclair Main was the consultant that conducted the review. He had access to all of the research that had gone in Teagasc over the last 15 years to look at it all and to make sure that we were online with recommendations and correct, number one. And secondly, then to highlight gaps in the research knowledge that has been that has not been undertaken, that we need stronger focus on. So it was to consolidate all the research that has been done and to give a future direction of where we need to go with our grass-clover research and our multi-species research to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the stakeholders in the industry.
And what were the main findings from that process?
Yeah, so look, there was 11 key recommendations that came out of it as a whole across the whole thing. And look, there's a couple of there that kind of look at an overall coordination group that was in it. But I suppose the main findings here is to I'll read it exactly here now. So is that there is a clear justification that when we have adequate levels of clover in the sward, we can reduce INIX up to 100 to 120 kilos of chemical nitrogen taken out in the system while maintaining herbage production at where we were with grass-only swards at high level of nitrogen. So all of the research from all of this in Teagasc, that was the key finding, that we know when we have enough clover, we can, at that 20%, we can take out up to 100 to 120 kilos of nitrogen and still maintain production, while herbage production, while increasing overall animal performance. There is the nitrogen strategy that was developed for it is tailoring to that and adjusting based on the levels of clover that we have in our system. There is going to be strategic oversowing required to maintain clover in those swards between it. And there is a difference between the varieties of white clover that is there and ensuring that we're always using the best variety of it. In terms of some of the gaps in knowledge, more work needed around biological nitrogen fixation, the factors that are influencing it, and to get key time points to be more strategic to bring that nitrogen planner onto the next phase in terms of being more dynamic to adapt to those scenarios like we had last year, like we're having this year, to be more dynamic and interactive in terms of where we are with our nitrogen strategies on it. So as a whole, very positive towards grass white clover research. A lot of work done that has shown we are getting significant benefits and can reducing up to 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. But there is still areas of research that required, particularly around the strategic fertilizer applications, to ensure that we're getting the best of both while maintaining production.
Thanks very much, Mike.
You're very welcome, James. Thank you.
Just to let our listeners know, everything we discussed on today's episode will be covered in detail at the Teagasc Moor Park Open Day on Wednesday the 2nd of July. The theme of this year's event is Innovating for the Future, so do get the date in the diary. Whether you go with your discussion group or bring the family, it promises to be a very informative day. That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Mike Egan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.